The year was 1619. On the shores of Virginia, near the small English settlement of Jamestown, a ship appeared on the horizon. It was called the White Lion. To the colonists, it seemed like just another vessel arriving from across the Atlantic. But hidden within its dark hold were around 20 captured Africans. As they stepped onto American soil, no one could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in American history. A chapter that would last for more than 2 centuries. A chapter filled with suffering, cruelty, and unimaginable injustice. At the time, the English colonies in North America were expanding rapidly. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, and tobacco had become a gold mine for plantation owners. The profits were enormous. Some plantation owners earned several times their original investment. But there was one problem. Growing tobacco required endless labor. The work was exhausting. The summer heat was brutal. Disease was common. Many white workers refused to endure such conditions. Native Americans also resisted working on the plantations. The plantation owners wanted a solution. And they found one in the transatlantic slave trade. Across the Atlantic Ocean, European traders were already buying and selling human beings on a massive scale. Along the western coast of Africa, countless men, women, and children were captured during wars, raids, and kidnappings. Some were sold by rival African rulers. Others were seized directly by slave traders. Families were torn apart in an instant. Parents never saw their children again. Children never saw their parents again. Bound in chains, they were marched to the coast and packed into slave ships. The journey across the Atlantic became known as the Middle Passage. For many, it was a voyage of death. The holds of slave ships were overcrowded and filthy. Prisoners were packed together so tightly they could barely move. Disease spread quickly. Food and water were scarce. Punishments were brutal. Thousands died before ever reaching America. But the profits were so enormous that traders continued bringing more and more captives across the ocean. By the 18th century, slavery had become deeply embedded in the economy of the American colonies. Laws were passed to protect slave owners and strip enslaved Africans of every basic human right. They could not vote. They could not own property. They could not freely marry. They could not choose where they lived or worked. In many colonies, slave owners could beat, torture, or even kill enslaved people with little fear of punishment. Racial divisions were deliberately strengthened. Authorities created laws designed to separate white servants from black slaves. Fear and racism became tools for maintaining control. For enslaved people, life was a constant struggle. On tobacco and cotton plantations in the South, workers labored from sunrise to sunset under the blazing sun. Some worked 14, 16, or even 18 hours a day. A moment of rest could bring the crack of a whip. Many lived in overcrowded cabins with poor food and little medical care. Their labor generated enormous wealth. But they received nothing in return. Yet despite the oppression, enslaved people never stopped resisting. Some slowed their work. Some sabotaged equipment. Others escaped into forests and swamps. And some chose to fight. In 1712, enslaved Africans in New York launched an uprising against their masters. The rebellion was crushed, and many participants were executed. In 1739, another major revolt erupted near Charleston in South Carolina. Hundreds of enslaved people attempted to march toward freedom in Spanish Florida. They were eventually defeated. Then, in 1831, one of the most famous slave rebellions in American history shook Virginia. It was led by a man named Nat Turner. Believing he had been chosen to fight slavery, Turner and his followers launched a violent uprising that terrified slave owners throughout the South. Although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it exposed the growing fear and instability within the slave system. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. The colonies had won independence from Britain and created a new nation based on the ideals of liberty and equality. Yet millions remained in chains. Many of the nation's most powerful leaders were slave owners. Even the first president, George Washington, owned enslaved people. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. How could a nation dedicated to freedom continue to tolerate slavery? The answer became even more complicated in 1793. That year, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. The machine dramatically increased the speed of cotton processing. Suddenly, cotton production became more profitable than ever before. Plantation owners rushed to expand their operations. And with expansion came a greater demand for enslaved labor. Instead of fading away, slavery became stronger. The South grew increasingly dependent on it. The North, however, was moving in a different direction. Factories, railroads, and industry were transforming the northern states. Industrial employers needed skilled and motivated workers rather than forced labor. Gradually, northern states began abolishing slavery. A divide was emerging. One America was moving toward free labor. The other was becoming more dependent on slavery. As the country expanded westward, the question became unavoidable. Would new states allow slavery or prohibit it? Political compromises delayed the conflict but never solved it. The tension continued to grow. Meanwhile, a powerful movement against slavery began to emerge. These activists became known as abolitionists. They published newspapers, organized public speeches, and exposed the horrors of slavery to the nation. Many risked their lives helping enslaved people escape. Together they created a secret network known as the Underground Railroad. Despite its name, it was not a railroad at all. It was a network of safe houses, hidden routes, and courageous volunteers. Night after night, escaped slaves moved northward toward freedom. Some settled in free states. Others continued all the way to Canada. One of the most heartbreaking stories was that of Solomon Northup. A free black man living in New York, he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in Louisiana. For 12 years he lived as a slave before finally regaining his freedom. His story shocked the nation. By 1860, slavery had become one of the most valuable economic institutions in America. Millions of enslaved people generated wealth worth billions of dollars. Plantation owners viewed slavery as essential to their survival. Abolitionists viewed it as a moral evil. The nation stood divided. Then came the election of Abraham Lincoln. Although Lincoln initially focused on preventing the expansion of slavery, many Southern leaders feared that their entire system was under threat. One by one, Southern states left the Union and formed their own government. The Confederate States of America. In April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had begun. It would become the bloodiest conflict in American history. For 4 years, brother fought brother. More than 200,000 black soldiers eventually joined the Union Army, many of them former slaves fighting for their own freedom. As the war continued, Lincoln took a historic step. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring freedom for enslaved people in Confederate territory. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It had become a struggle against slavery itself. Finally, in 1865, the Confederacy was defeated. The Union emerged victorious. Soon afterward, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. The institution that had shaped American society for more than 2 centuries was finally destroyed. But freedom did not erase the scars. Generations of suffering, violence, and injustice had left a deep mark on the nation. The story of slavery in America remains one of the most painful chapters in human history. A reminder of how greed and prejudice can strip people of their humanity. and a reminder of the extraordinary courage shown by those who never stopped fighting for freedom, even when freedom seemed impossible.